Yusuf. This is a strange topic that I'm going to talk about. Uh, Many of you might have not heard of the Clementine recognitions. Now, I haven't been able to get my hands on these writings. I've never read them. But if you read a brief overview, I was found a couple not summaries, but overviews or commentary, I should say, on them, done by different scholars, and it's very strange. For the longest time, well, for basically the history of Christianity up until about the 1800s, the Clementine recognitions were considered to be 4th or 5th century writings, or even solid 4th or solid 5th century writings. 410 to 450 or whatever. Until about the German school of theology, the ones that came up, Wellhausen came out of this school. A lot of the secular, what secular biblical scholars would use as German school of thought, started looking back into it and said, no, this is early 2nd century, which is very early. And there's multiple views. I'm not going to really go into it, but saying that it's either late 2nd century or early 2nd century, and arguing back and forth. And it's very strange that you'd see that critical scholars, secular scholars, would now the German schools of theology weren't secular as today we would consider secular. But even modern day scholars are saying that no, they're a lot earlier than everybody thought, and there are reasons for that. They say that they are quoted by the church fathers, which is very odd. You would think that if it's quoted, I mean, these people are trying to say it's the same, basically at the same time that the recognitions were written down, the church fathers were writing, which is odd because why would they quote something that's not that well known? That would almost you'd almost have to assume it was at an earlier date than that. But it made me think. When I was growing up, I always thought that there were pieces of the truth in the Gospels. That the Gospel of Mark was probably an amalgamation of people that knew, or people who knew the apostles, writing this stuff down. Because it just looks primitive. It looks so early. And that maybe it was written about 110 AD. And I always had believed that the Matthew and Luke were definitely late 2nd century writings, and that John was a writing in progress. It was probably the second earliest written, but it got completed just after Nicaea, and that Matthew and Luke were probably finished around Nicaea 325. If you guys, well, everybody knows the count. You know what? I shouldn't say everybody knows the Council of Nicaea. I assume too much of people's knowledge. But if you look at all the scholars, all place uh, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke well inside the 1st century, and most place John inside the 1st century. Some may say some of the writings of John are into the 2nd century. Now, the Gospel of Mark is ridiculously early because if you read it, Jesus really isn't teaching. It's almost, and it keeps saying immediately, immediately. I think I counted 27 times in the first 2 chapters that the Gospel of Mark says immediately. And there's just strange things in there. The man says, and I see men walking around like trees when Jesus heals. And it's kind of you read stuff like that, at least I do, and I said, that's something strange that has to be very early. And even when you read it, it doesn't. It's extremely dry, very dry. And there's also the first time I read Mark, and he felt compassion, and it angered him, and somebody who saw these events happening. Why it has the name Mark, I have no idea. Everybody's kind of confused about the names. Uh, and I was always taught there was Mark, and then there was Q Doctrine, and then John was just crap. I believe John and Mark are the earliest. People try to say, "Oh, the beginning of John or certain parts of it or later." That's fine. Uh, don't care about that. Or the ending of Mark is later. Okay. Uh, but I still believe that the majority of John and the majority of Mark are early. Uh, 50s, 60s, I'd say. The 50s or the 60s. Matthew and Luke I'd place later. And Matthew and Luke are very strange because they seem to be working off a template of Mark. And I had always been taught that it went Mark, Matthew, Luke, and the only reason Matthew was first is because it had a birth narrative. Uh, but if you see it, it looks as if um, Matthew and Luke have this other source, and the other source is just source Queller, however you pronounce it, I don't know German. Source, the Q source, they call it. Because you have things like Sermon on the Mount. You have a lot of these teachings, or preachings, I should say, parables that don't occur in Mark, but they occur in different forms in Luke and in Matthew. And even thinking about that these are that early, it's actually kind of disturbing. One of the reasons, when I was much younger, thinking that Matthew and Luke were later is because obviously there was no virgin birth. So this had to be, you see the beginnings of this exalting the Virgin Mary, where in Mark you have Jesus saying, like, you have Mary thinking he's crazy. Why does he think he's the Messiah? Which, of course, why would she be saying this kind of stuff if Jesus was born with a miraculous birth and an angel talked to Mary? And in Mark, we don't see angels. Uh, but in Luke and in Matthew, angels play a big part. I don't think there's no ascension story definitely in Mark, and some claim that in Mark there is no resurrection. It just ends with the woman running away scared from the tomb. So what does this have to do with the Clementine recognitions? I think we're going to find out as scholarship progresses. There's going to be breakthroughs, and we're going to wind up finding a lot more documents, um, or be able to look at the documents now in a different way. Documents we have now in a different way in the future. I think some things are going to wind up being a lot older than anybody ever suspected. And there might be some things that are much later than anybody suspected. Now, there's probably not any document out there like, some Da Vinci Code document of, oh, it's just shit. But I think we're going to wind up finding things that just blow certain ideas out of the water. Now, if you were to ask me a few years ago, and I don't know if I should even be saying this, I would say Peter was not written. Neither letters of Peter were written by Peter. Nothing of John was written by John, and that Paul is the only person we can ascribe any writing to, and none of his pastoral letters should be attributed to him. The Didache seems very early. It seems like it's earlier, just in my view, than a lot of the Catholic epistles. James, I don't think was written by James. Again, this is not the current view that I hold, but the current view, if I told you, would probably make your toes curl. But I think there's going to be certain things where we're going to find out they're much earlier than than anybody's ever imagined, even the biblical, even the really hardcore Bible believers. And I think there's going to be some things where they're so late, or they were written for such reasons that uh, to show they weren't in there. They should maybe that they're not important, or they don't have the weight that many of the fundamentalists rely on. What does this mean for orthodoxy? Well, absolutely nothing. What does it mean for the other branches of Christianity? Catastrophic. See, scholarship doesn't affect orthodoxy. Well, people, oh, well, then you're just like the Hindus or the Buddhists, where it doesn't matter. No, no, no. Because the authority, even if you're the Bible, authority rests in the church. Teaching rests in the church. The life rests in the church. This this codex, this compilation of books that we call the New Testament, uh, nobody in the first 3 centuries sat down and read them. The New Testament didn't exist in the form that it does now. And in different cities, you'd have different writings. Maybe in Rome, you'd have Luke, or you'd have Mark and Romans, and maybe a couple other epistles, maybe Shepherd of Hermes, Clementine writings, First Clement. In Greece, you'd probably have Luke, a few Pauline letters, and that's it. In other places like Alexandria, you might have, or Antioch, you'd have the writings of Ignatius, you'd have Pauline letters, you'd have uh, maybe Luke and John or Mark. And in Alexandria, you'd probably have Matthew, Hebrews, things like this, James, and then later on it was put together. So whether the dating is very early or very late, it doesn't affect orthodoxy because the whole basis is totally different. If, the, if well, I shouldn't be happy if it's catastrophic to anybody's faith, but there probably will be in my grave in centuries from now if they find this stuff out. My dead body will probably have a smirk on it. Um, I don't know. Just an interesting topic. If anybody knows where I can read the Clementine recognitions, please message me.